you, Nicholas, for that introduction, and thank you for organizing this, this event. I will jump into the slides because we have a little warm-up exercise. Just so we're speaking the same language when we talk about explainability and why it's important in our models and in our AI solutions. Here we have 6 images, each either a husky or a wolf, and we imagine that we have an image classification algorithm that is trying to differentiate between these 2 cases. And at first glance, it seems to do a fairly good job, and we maybe can have some good confidence that our algorithm will keep working the way we want it to. But if we introduce some basic level of explainability, where we ask which parts of the image were important for these classifications, we can see that the algorithm is not doing things the way we might like it to do. It's not taking into account the parts of the image that we know from our context are important. For instance, a wolf is still a wolf, whether or not it's standing on snow. This is the LIME framework for explainability, and those of you who are a little familiar with the topic may have seen this example before. So, to introduce myself, my name is Theo. I'm here at the Die Labor in Berlin. I'm not sure you can see up here on the 14th floor. We have a very beautiful view of the Straße den 17. Juli. And I work on the EMPAIA project. And I'll do a little to introduce that and introduce the focus for within healthcare on which I work. After that, this talk will be quite introductory in terms of introducing and defining the terminology that we talk about in the context of within the topic of explainability, motivating a little explainability within healthcare and within digital pathology in particular, and comparing some of the approaches and some of the challenges and limitations of these. Okay, so I know I marketed this talk as explainability in healthcare, but this is the specific domain within healthcare that I work is pathology. And for those of you not familiar with pathology, it is essentially a mechanism for turning samples of tissue into medical reports. Pathology is the study of disease, and to give you a very brief crash course into the kind of pathology workflow that we deal with in EMPAIA, I have, a very brief crash course. So imagine we have a patient that has a suspected melanoma. In order to really get the gold standard of diagnosis for this patient, we are going to try and look at the individual cells involved. And this involves taking an excision from the patient. I apologize for the gory details here. It doesn't get any worse than this. This sample is encapsulated in a paraffin wax, sliced into incredibly thin slices. This process is called microtoming. These slices are of the order of microns thick, so thousandth of a millimeter. These are stained to highlight important features within the tissue, cell membranes and nuclei, and loaded onto a glass slide that a pathologist will then examine. And so just a disclaimer, I am not a pathologist. I work very closely with pathologists, and much of my domain knowledge has come from their generous interne Fortbildung, their generous training. And one of the most remarkable aspects of pathology is that this process is done very often on an intraoperative basis. So these slides are taken and prepared while a patient is still on the table being operated on, and the pathologist can come back with some prognosis or diagnosis that then influences the ongoing operation. So this is the traditional way that pathology is done. It's still the way that most pathology is done in terms of looking at glass slides with a microscope. And there is now, with the availability of integrated health records and these very sophisticated slide scanners that digitize these glass slides, we are moving into an era of digital pathology, where rather than being done through an analog microscope, the work of pathologists is being done on a screen or shared by sort of telepresence with other pathologists, potentially in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, all working on the same case. This is an example of an interface, the kind of interface we're dealing with for viewing these slides. And if you can imagine, if we are dealing with an image here that is the entire size of one of these tissue slides, potentially 1-2 centimeters wide, and we are viewing it with a magnification where we can see individual cells and recognize particular diagnostic features of those individual cells, these files are enormous. And enormous in the sense that one case file can be from tens of gigabytes to terabytes large. So this introduces some challenges to doing digital pathology, to more pathology workflow becoming digitized, in the sense that these are very difficult. There's difficult file formats to work with. The formats produced by scanners are often, are proprietary, and there are a large number of different scanner manufacturers, and these files are often found or siloed within the institutions that they, within institutional databases, for instance, pathology laboratories, hospitals, and universities. And there is a lack of standards with regards to how these can be made accessible, how the annotations made by pathologists can be made in a standard way to facilitate the sharing of this data. You can imagine this kind of workflow can sometimes involve the identification and grading of maybe a small number of cells, maybe a handful of individual cells within one of these enormous image files. So this is the image analysis techniques from machine learning and more broadly AI are lend themselves very well to these kind of tasks. The workload for pathologists is rising, and the number of new pathologists being trained is decreasing. So there's a huge demand for AI solutions. And this is the motivation for the EMPAIA project. EMPAIA is a very slightly forced acronym of Ecosystem for Pathology Diagnostics with AI Assistance. And the main goals of EMPAIA are to create a data platform for sharing pathology data, and an AI platform for providing AI solutions that meet a set of agreed upon standards that can be made available in an app store-like interface for pathology users. And in order that those standards are generated and meet the required regulatory, the regulatory, changing regulatory landscape regarding AI solutions in healthcare, part of the EMPAIA project also constitutes committees that work with regulating bodies, work with reference centers and validators to create these standards and make sure that the AI solutions and the data on the platforms adhere to these. Just to give, I'm sorry about the noise outside. I hope that doesn't come through too badly on the microphone. The EMPAIA consortium, one moment, Charité. The partners in the EMPAIA consortium are the Charité, Dye-Labor, Fraunhofer, and a number of industrial partners, Dye-Labor being the partner with which I am working, and we are primarily dealing with the topic of AI explainability in the solutions provided by the EMPAIA platform. So in order to talk about explainability in healthcare, we have to have some common understanding of what we're talking about with explainability. And this term is by no means widely agreed upon in terms of its definition and the aspects of AI that it encompasses. It's what we can say for certain that explainability is at least a subset of AI transparency, where AI transparency involves having access to important information about your AI solutions. And somewhere within this is the topic of explainability, and it may well incorporate some of these aspects of transparency, but I would like to give some motivation to how we make this differentiation about where transparency, or not where transparency ends, where transparency becomes explainability. So you can think of transparency as having access to the model, the machine learning models we're using as part of our AI solutions for pathology or for healthcare in general, having access to the parameters, the weights of those models, whatever intermediate results they might produce, and the data that's used to train them. And this is very important, and this is a legal requirement to have this access, but we can take this a step further with explainability. And we talk about explainability as understanding, for instance, the internal logic that our models use to reach an outcome, and not just having the training data, but really understanding the impact of biases, outliers, and incompleteness in that data. Now, I'm sure there is we don't need to motivate too strongly the need for explainability in AI. We can think about this in terms of being able to improve or understand where our model is going wrong. If we understand why it is reaching conclusions, we can understand why the incorrect conclusions it comes to have been made, and understand better how we can improve, how we can fix those problems. It is a matter of trust in terms of we, or pathologists as users, need to be able to trust the predictions that their models are making, and justify those predictions to their patients and to themselves. And provided, and so these first three criteria are very much to do with when we don't have models that we know yet that are trustworthy. Maybe they are making good predictions, but we don't know they are making predictions for the right reasons. If we come to this point where we trust our models, we find them trustworthy and accurate, then perhaps explainability gives us an insight into or an access to the knowledge that is being encoded in that pattern, in the recognition of those patterns that our models do. In terms of maybe we can learn new things about the data, not just on a global level in terms of pushing the frontiers of our medical understanding, but also on an individual level as a tool for training new pathologists, training new healthcare experts. And most importantly, because explainability is in some way, in some interpretation, a legal prerequisite of AI solutions to be used in a clinical setting. And the right to explanation and the GDPR regulations on AI transparency are becoming concretized into more definite guidelines for how we implement explainability in AI for healthcare. Now, two terms that are often used in the context of explainability are explainability and interpretability. And there is still some lack of consensus as to where we draw the distinction between these. They're very often used interchangeably. I would like to define, or at least propose, some kind of distinction between these. This is also partly based on the Gilpin paper explaining explanations, which is quite widely cited within this field. And if we think of the space of models that we can use to describe some data, or the space of models that we can learn, for instance, neural networks and decision trees displayed here. Now, we can think of interpretability as some intrinsic property of the type of model we are presenting, in the sense that it is inherently very hard for a human being to intuitively interpret what the weights of a neural network mean. You can have access to these, but the meaning there and the reasoning and the logic is hidden within the complexity of the system. On the other hand, there are other modalities like decision trees, rule lists, data that's visualized in 2 or 3 dimensions that intuitively we find more accessible as human beings. And we can think of interpretability as being some kind of fuzzy scale where some modalities are less interpretable and some are more interpretable. Now, when we talk about explainability, we talk about producing an explanation for why a model has reached a certain conclusion. We are dealing with this question of why. And a question of why and an explanation in and of itself is in some way a reduction of complexity. We have complex systems and we try to ask, why is something happening? And we are producing an explanation that is a simplification of the complexity that is inherent. Now, the balance here is that if we reduce the complexity, if we provide an explanation that is a simplification of our complex system, our complex neural network, our explanation is inherently less complete than the model we are trying to describe. It doesn't capture all of the variables. It doesn't capture all of the complexity. So this brings us to an idea of explainability, where we try to make our models we try to make our explanations as interpretable as possible without losing the important information, or to say, whilst retaining as much of the important information as possible. So it's striking this balance between the interpretability of a model and the completeness that we are with which we are describing for instance, our learning model. Now, there are some very complicated attempts to define a whole taxonomy of explainability and different approaches towards explainability. And I'm going to try and give very briefly a simplified version of that. We can think of explainability as broken down into two main axes. On the one axis, we think about what the scope of our explanation is. Does an explanation for a model, or does an explanation tell us about the reasoning of the whole model, or does it give some logic for an individual result? On the other axis, we have the idea of whether the explainability is something that is built into the model, i.e. we try to build a model that is in and of itself more human interpretable. And on the other side, explainability that is added after the fact. We have a model that is essentially a black box model. It is not an interpretable model, and we try and introduce some explainability afterwards. And we talk about this in terms of post-hoc explainability, whereas built-in explainability is intrinsic or anti-hoc. Now, this post-hoc explainability methods can be broken down further in terms of whether they are applicable to only specific models or whether they are applicable to any given model. And this is less of a dichotomy than a spectrum, and also a fuzzy one at that, in the sense that many approaches for post-hoc explainability can, in theory, be applied to any given model, but when they are implemented, this implementation is model specific. And I'll give an example of such approaches. So if we think about anti-hoc explainability, this is a good example. If the target model that we're trying to learn is a rule list, in this case, we have a probabilistic set of if-else statements. And this is essentially the outcome of our learned model. It is a global explanation that gives us some idea of, for instance, in this case, the probability of stroke given certain preconditions. Now, this is very powerful in terms of explainability. This is arguably very interpretable at first glance to a medical expert. But can we apply this kind of explainability, anti-hoc explainability, to the typical use cases that we have in digital pathology, or by extension, any field of medicine which deals heavily with image analysis tasks? Now, this is a classic use case for AI, or at least machine learning within diagnostic pathology, where we have this incredibly large, high-resolution image. This is potentially 100,000 by 100,000 pixels, and the parts of the image we are interested, that we are trying to find, are these isolated micrometastases, so isolated clumps of cancer cells that have, in this case, metastasized from breast cancer to the sentinel lymph nodes under the armpit. And the task of a pathologist in this case is to find and grade these tiny areas of this huge image. So this is a very, this is a classic, this is a poster child for AI in digital pathology. And as you might imagine, the kinds of machine learning architectures that are suitable for these kind of tasks are almost exclusively convolutional neural networks or something similar. And these are inherently sort of deep neural networks, and it's very hard to imagine how we can make such deep neural networks inherently interpretable. There are some attempts to this end, but they're questionable in terms of how inherently interpretable they render these deep neural networks. So the class of explainability methods or approaches that we tend to focus on within diagnostic pathology are post-hoc methods. And to give a very rough sketch of how this works in terms of our AI system, we have our AI system infrastructure and a learned model trained by some training data that is in and of itself not interpretable. People talk about this in terms of black box models. I think this is a good way to think about this. Now, if we introduce post-hoc explainability, essentially we are implementing some kind of explanation generator that takes our learned model and produces some kind of explanation that can be presented to the user in a user interface. And with this post-hoc explainability, we then talk about this as an explainable AI system. Some common approaches for this are, first of all, back-propagation or relevance back-propagation, where we take the learned weights of our neural network and we, from some classification output, if we have for instance here, we have a classification algorithm that is classifying an image to on the class cat, right? And we use the weights learned by our neural network and propagate from some classification back to find which areas of the input image were the most relevant or to that classification, i.e. to which areas of the image was that classification most sensitive. And there are there are many approaches that work upon the same principle, and they are all very fast, in the sense we are using sort of the inherent back-propagation process that's inherent to training on neural networks. And this is a case where, in theory, this approach can be applied to a very large class of learned models. But in practice, to implement this theory, we need to have access to the internal weights of the model. So the implementation with this is highly model specific. If we want to use this on a new model, we have to build a new back-propagation sort of implementation. And here's an example of this this technique used on diagnostic pathology data, where we have a region of interest from some pathology slide, and this has been given, for instance, a classification of cancer versus non-cancer, and we find which regions of the image were the most relevant for cancer, or most relevant for this classification of cancer. And potentially this gives the pathologist a good insight into at least, the model is looking at the right areas. Perhaps it gives them a pointer of where they should look in order to confirm or attest this decision. So this is a good start. Another class of approaches is an activation optimization, where rather than trying to understand to what input or what parts of the input a particular classification is most sensitive, we give a model many instances either of the input, either from different points within the input data or of synthetic inputs, in order to maximize the activation of a particular region within the network. And this could be a particular neuron, it could be a particular layer within the network, or a set or a subgraph. And this is a technique for trying to understand, okay, what features has this neuron learned to recognize? And this is kind of a way to to dissect and deconstruct the function of different parts of the network. Now, this again is highly model specific in its implementation, in the sense that in order to do this, you have to have full access to the internal parameters of a model. And moreover, the speed at which you could do that, this is relatively slow, because this involves essentially probing the model each time with different inputs and seeing how the network reacts. And an example of this done on pathology data, trying to visualize the sort of the role of different filters within the network on some pathology data. A third approach, and the approach that we looked at in the first slide of this presentation, is in terms of input perturbation, where we have some input image with a classification and a confidence in that classification, and we essentially sort of programmatically remove parts of this image and see how the confidence of our model reacts. And by bringing together all of these sort of partially occluded images, we can build up a picture of to which parts of the image was the model most sensitive to deletion. And this sort of gives us some kind of proxy idea of which parts of the image were the most important for the model for that classification. And an advantage of this is that it is the only things you need in order to implement this are the inputs and the outputs of a model. You can treat your model completely as a black box and feed it inputs, feed it perturbed inputs, and see how it reacts. The downside of this is doing this is incredibly slow, as you are essentially querying your model many, many times just to get one result. This model agnosticism is quite attractive within the context of a platform like EMPAIA, where the idea is to provide many different solutions. And if we can provide a framework for explainability that doesn't require having insight into those solutions, because as they often are they're provided by external manufacturers who don't want to give us, or don't want to give anyone, the access to the internal weights of their model. So it comes with its downsides, but this is an interesting approach within this context. And see the same approach applied to a pathology image, giving some kind of heat map for which parts of the image are most relevant for instance, a classification of cancer. So these are three approaches. There are many others, and essentially these are three approaches for producing explanations, and they in and of themselves don't necessarily define exactly how you provide this explanation to a user. I mean, these the approaches of post-hoc explainability that essentially highlight which areas of the image were relevant for a classification lend themselves very well to these kind of heat maps. And this is by far the most common modality for explainability, as people talk about it, certainly within this domain in image analysis in healthcare. Partly because, or in large part because, there are so many different ways to provide a heat map. There are so many different tricks and approaches we can use from the machine learning world to provide some kind of projection onto the input space to give an idea of the relevance of different parts of the image. Relatively less frequent are providing synthetic visualizations, where we provide potentially a counterfactual example for a given classification algorithm. This particular approach is based on CycleGAN, so using a style transfer algorithm to, first of all, learn a style for healthy tissue and unhealthy tissue based on some ground truth data, and then for a particular region of interest that we're looking at, that a pathologist is looking at, that has a particular classification, to apply the opposing style to the same image data and try to provide some idea of what would the classification algorithm, or what would the counterfactual result for this classification algorithm look like? And the third class, or a third class of explanation modality, is in these kind of fictitious pathologist annotations. And these are fairly experimental in terms of their implementation. This is essentially using something like a transformer network, something like GTP3, to try and fill in the next word in a textual explanation, given some feature recognition from the image data. Now, I mentioned that these visualizations on the input, these kind of heat maps, saliency maps, are by far the most commonly implemented explanation modality at the moment. And another aspect of that is that for synthetic visualizations or synthetic annotations, the more convincing you make fictitious data, the greater the potential for misleading the user is, especially if that user is a pathologist and doesn't have necessarily the insight into the AI algorithms that produce these explanations. So in some way, there is a potential for providing more qualitative explanations with generative data, but it requires a much better understanding of the expectations and limitations regarding expectations and the limitations of these AI algorithms. Now, to go deeper on this, what do we mean by an explanation? Now, clearly, this is a very big topic in explainability, but it's not so much not one that we go into in so much detail when we talk about the different approaches for post-hoc explainability, the different algorithms that we can use for this. Now, to give you a simple example, here we have my beautiful face, and I've passed this through an age and gender detection algorithm, and it is as of last week correct on my age. Now, I can imagine this, this is a fun toy app, but you can imagine it used in a critical domain. You can imagine it used to make important decisions, for instance, in the Charité of the future, when we use image recognition technology to determine the age of alcohol buyers. And in this case, it might be very important for me to understand why is this classification being made on my face. Now, I could ask this question of why to my algorithm if I have some explainability infrastructure built in, and it could give me this perfectly valid, perfectly correct answer. Now, this is arguably useful. It at least gives us a baseline of understanding whether the algorithm is even taking into account roughly the right portion of the input data, but it's not very informative. Now, I could refine my algorithm, my explainability algorithm further, and it could give me this kind of heat map, and this is quite representative of the current approaches for image analysis tasks in healthcare in terms of explainability. But this still leaves me with some open questions. It still leaves me unable to go deeper on this question of why. Like, for instance, why are the area under, what is it about the area under my eyes that leads to this classification? Does my beard make me look older, or does it make me look younger because it's not white and wispy? And of course, when we start to go down this route, we can see that the answer to what is an adequate explanation is, it very much depends. And it very much depends on who the audience for the explanation is, what level of detail they require, and in what domain, language, and modality they require this explanation in order to understand what algorithms are doing and how they are reaching their outcomes. Now, so far, and as I've introduced, much of this topic of explainability is being driven from the machine learning side, at least in this domain. And in order to really come to an adequate answer to this question, we need to bring in these other domains of where do our users come from and how do they interact with the system. If we think about the topic of explainability as a bridge, where we are right now is in terms of thinking, what is possible? How many different clever machine learning techniques can we use to produce, for instance, a heat map? And these act as good reality checks for our algorithms and potentially good tools for developers to better understand their algorithms and refine them. But where we're potentially missing is this question of what is necessary. what do users really need in order to understand the internal reasoning and the limitations of the models they are using? And how can these explanations be independently validated? And what kind of studies do we need to make in order to really understand how these algorithms are used in practice or will be used in practice? As we are often in this chicken and egg scenario where the lack of explainability is a hurdle to the implementation or the deployment of AI in clinical practice, and we can't make these usage studies until we have usage data from AI solutions being used in clinical practice. So this is a bridge that needs to be built from both ends, and EMPAIA is in some parts looking to start making this connection. And I would invite you, if this is a topic that is interesting to you, to join me here at the DiLab working on EMPAIA. I would be very happy if after this talk, if you have any questions, to get in touch with me. But I think right now, I'd say thank you very much and hand over to Nicholas for the questions from the audience.